I'm going to be interviewing Janetta McKenzie, who is the Director of Oil and Gas for Pembina Institute, about a press release her organization released today called Grand Bargain Would Result in More Oil Sands Emissions, Not Less. Welcome to the interview, Janetta.
Thank you very much, Markham.
Now, a lot of our viewers won't know what Grand Bargain refers to. Maybe you could give us a bit of an overview first.
Yeah, so we're referring to some of the discourse that we've heard in the media about what type of negotiation or what type of agreement might be sort of in the negotiation process between the province of Alberta and the federal government. And what this might entail is a new bitumen pipeline out west, probably, but also the Pathways Alliance carbon capture project getting built and finally getting steel in the ground. This has been referred to as the Pathways Plus sort of concept, and has been cited by the Prime Minister and by the federal government as potentially on the next list of major projects that we might see released from the Major Projects Office.
I want to make a point here and get your comment on it, Janetta, is that this is not a bargain for taxpayers because this project, the Pathways Carbon Capture and Storage project, was proposed 5 years ago. It was said at that time that the industry was prepared to do it, but it needed a lot of government support. We've now seen federal investment tax credits worth up to 50% of the project. We've seen Alberta bring in 12% incentives, so that's 62% altogether. There are other federal incentives on the table that could bring it up even higher, and they had promised to do it already. So essentially, it's like, okay, we're going to do what we promised to do, and taxpayers are going to pay for it, and then you're going to give us a pipeline on top of all of that. That makes not a lot of sense to me.
Yeah, the sort of balance of this type of proposal doesn't seem to quite work out, and that's what we looked at in our report that we released today. A new pipeline would significantly increase oil sands emissions, even if it's paired with this type of carbon capture project. And so connecting these two projects isn't really so much a grand bargain because the scales don't really balance out. The emissions from oil sands if a new pipeline were built more than offset the ability of the proposed Pathways Alliance project to capture carbon. And it also doesn't work not simply because the emissions don't balance out, it's because fast tracking a pipeline will not guarantee that oil sands companies will then invest to reduce their emissions and invest in this carbon capture project. As you've noted, Markham, there's a lot of financial support on the table already via the federal government tax credit, the Alberta Carbon Capture Incentive Program, but a regulatory backstop, I think we can say very confidently in 2025, is needed to make this type of investment happen. And that regulatory backstop in the form of good, strong, ambitious industrial carbon pricing, we propose is the way to incentivize investment in that project, in those types of carbon capture project, and really begin to see capital investment flow in to build that type of project, and then install a pretty significant piece of emissions reduction technology in the oil sands in Alberta. But it's when it gets twinned with a brand new pipeline, especially when we have a lot of other infrastructure at our disposal, that things can get a little bit muddy.
Okay, let's talk about the three scenarios that you modeled. Maybe you could explain those to us.
Yeah, absolutely. So we effectively did a sort of medium-term forecast of what oil sands emissions might look like under a few different scenarios. One is we call it the current measures scenario. This is based on the Canada Energy Regulator's current measures scenario. And we assume under this scenario, kind of business as usual, there's no new pipeline and also no Pathways project installed. And we see that emissions are still quite high in 2035, which is when we modeled out to. In all of these scenarios, we assumed other emissions intensity improvements, kind of on par with the last 5 years, which we think is quite optimistic for the sector, but we do want to be fair and take into account those other options. Our second scenario was a current measures plus pathways scenario. So this is one where production grows in line with global demand as per the Canada Energy Regulator's current measures scenario. There's no new pipeline, but the Pathways project is built. And we do begin to see emissions come down under this scenario, even as production grows to meet a reasonable expectation of demand in the next 10 years. Thirdly, we have what we're calling our grand bargain scenario, where a new million barrel a day pipeline is built, production grows to fill it, and the Pathways project is built. So kind of what we're hearing sort of in the media and in the discourse lately. And under that scenario, we see emissions higher than in our current measures, sort of business as usual scenario, simply because the Pathways project on its own is a pretty big emissions reduction project, but this is a very high emitting sector. And increasing production to fill a million barrel a day pipeline just wipes out those gains from the Pathways Alliance project. You'd need the equivalent of about another 8 Pathways Alliance projects to make the sector net zero, which no one is asking for at this point, but just to illustrate the scale of the problem there.
There's another point I want to make, Janetta, about the historical trend for emissions here. Because in 2009, the emissions intensity per barrel from the oil sands was 83 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per barrel. Today, it's 66 kilograms of CO2. So it's gone down already quite significantly, but total emissions have gone up over that time, and they've climbed steadily every year because the sector keeps producing more oil. And the improvements on the per barrel basis are essentially wiped out by this new supply. And if you build a 1 million barrel a day, pipeline, and you have to increase supply to fill it, then essentially it's just the same old trend, but maybe tempered a little bit with the CCS project.
Yes, but I also think it's worth digging into emissions intensity improvements in the oil sands, sort of in the last 7 years specifically. We have seen a pretty good amount of emissions intensity improvements in the oil sands, as you say, since about 2009. But a lot of those improvements were in those first few years, 2009 to 2015, 2016. In the last 5 years or so, we've really seen those improvements begin to stagnate. There's still marginal improvements in emissions intensity, but it's really slowed the last few years. That is also something to keep in mind, where a lot of the easy stuff was done sort of in the mid 2010s, early 2010s. There's still more to be done to improve that emissions intensity beyond carbon capture, but it is important to note those trends have slowed too. Again, I think this really emphasizes the need for a good, strong industrial carbon pricing system, a good balanced credit market that can help incentivize innovation into some of those further emissions intensity improvements beyond carbon capture as well.
Yeah, I want to make another point here, which is that the improvements that have happened to date are not related to climate policy or climate ambitions of the company. They're things like improving efficiency. So to give you an example, Suncor's base mine boilers, they use huge amounts of steam, and they used to be fueled by petcoke, which is very carbon intense. Then they switched over, they spent about $1 billion, switched it over to natural gas. Why did they do that? Because it's more efficient and their costs came down. The fact that it had it improved emissions intensity per barrel was kind of a side benefit, but it wasn't the primary motivator. And there's a limit to how many of those kinds of improvements are available to the industry.
Absolutely. And that's one reason why we are seeing some of these emissions intensity improvements slow, because that stuff that made sense for 10 reasons has been done already. Now there's things that have more of a climate impact but are more expensive. There needs to be more of a reason to do them. And that's what systems like TIER and a good credit market can really incentivize. They can help sort of underwrite the financial case for things like a big carbon capture project, because that costs quite a bit of money to build and to operate. But if there's a credit market that you can generate an offset by doing carbon capture and then go sell that credit on the marketplace, that helps to make the financial case for a big project like that as well.
Yeah, let's talk about tier and the carbon credit market in Alberta. I've interviewed economist Dave Sawyer about this a couple of times, and he makes the point that in effect, the carbon market is broken. And it's broken for a number of reasons, and including a couple of changes that the Alberta government has made recently to weaken the market. But the fundamental problem here is that there are too many credits, and that lowers the price. So the headline price is $95 a ton. The effective price that companies pay is $25 a ton, which just isn't enough of an incentive for TIER to actually drive emissions reductions.
Yeah, absolutely. And this isn't a problem only in Alberta's tier system. It's a problem kind of in industrial carbon pricing across the country, but the biggest credit market, and it's very live in tier right now. The sort of crash of the credit prices that's happened over the last couple of years. Ideally, in a system like Alberta's and in like most output-based pricing systems, you want your credits, the price of your credits to be tracking pretty close to the headline price. And we're not seeing that in tier right now. We're seeing prices of, less than $25, which is quite below the headline price. And there have been a few announcements from the government of Alberta that signal that further weakening of that system might be on the table. The freezing of the headline price at $95 does sends some waves of uncertainty throughout the market that this is going to be a credit market that can incentivize big investments like the Pathways Alliance carbon capture or other carbon capture projects. There's also been an announcement that the government of Alberta will be developing a direct investment recognition mechanism where firms may be able to get credit for investing in emissions reductions as well as actually reducing the ton of emissions, which opens the door to, potentially double counting of emissions reductions and further will suppress demand for credits, leading to even more oversupply in the system.
I also want to bring up another issue here, and I started reporting on the industrial emitters carbon tax in 2014. And at that time, the oil sands companies were big supporters of it because they talked about needing to be carbon and cost competitive going forward because of global climate policies. And they were big supporters when the forerunner to tier CCIS was introduced in 2015. And that support has now evaporated because we've seen public letters from the CEOs to Prime Minister Mark Carney arguing for the end of industrial emitter carbon taxing in Canada. They say it's not internationally competitive. So all of that kind of undermines the argument for the grand bargain.
It does. It does undermine the argument for the grand bargain a little bit. And I do think like ultimately temporary one-off grand bargains between the governments of the day aren't going to create the climate competitive Canada that we're looking for right now. We need durable, predictable, long-term regulations like industrial carbon pricing that companies can count on and that governments that can count on that will not only get the Pathways project built, but pave the way for many more, Pathways scale projects that we'll need if we're serious about reducing oil sands emissions, which we do still need to be. But you're right, like taking a step back and looking at these trends in the sector over the last year, we've seen job cuts and cost cutting from oil sands firms. We've seen very little private sector commitment to a pipeline. The government of Alberta is currently the proponent for this potential pipeline project. We've seen a wholesale pushback against climate policy from oil and gas firms. And we also see, a little bit more globally, private sector oil demand scenarios that still see oil demand stagnating in the early 2030s from BP, from Shell and Equinor, even under their sort of highest oil demand scenarios, it's still stagnating in the early 2030s. So this version of the grand bargain, it really is a gamble that the world will not reduce oil consumption, which is a world with increasingly dangerous impacts of climate change, and doesn't seem to be sort of a bargain that particularly any private sector proponent is interested in putting their own money on the line for when it comes to the pipeline. But we do think there is a real opportunity here to fix industrial carbon pricing and unlock some of that private investment and private capital in oil sands decarbonization, also in heavy industry decarbonization writ more large.
I want to close the interview with this observation, Janetta, and that is because there are people who are going to watch this video and they're going to say, the climate change is a hoax. We don't need climate policy. It doesn't mean anything. It's just a waste. Get rid of all of it. But here's a counter argument to that. Europe has already, the EU has already implemented a carbon border adjustment mechanism. So everything that gets imported into the EU has the emissions intensity as tax. So Europe is supposed to be one of the markets where this pipeline would send oil. In China, which is supposed to be the primary market for that new pipeline, the Chinese government introduced in 2021 an industrial emitters carbon tax of its own, and it applied it first to the power sector, so it kind of, would learning by doing. And now it's applying it to other sectors, and the petrochemical and refining sector is slated for 2027, 2028. So why do the oil sands need to lower their emissions intensity? Is because they are going to be taxed in these other markets where they want to get into. It's in their self-interest to do this, not just public policy, not just, responding to climate change. It's an economic a business competitiveness issue.
I think this is a good point, Markham. And also, I think it's worth highlighting the two jurisdictions you've just mentioned, European Union and China. Obviously, we've spent a lot of the last several months sort of laser focused on changes in the United States, changes in our trading relationship with the United States. But two of the biggest markets in the world, the EU and China, are moving down the energy transition pathway for environmental reasons, for economic reasons, for energy security reasons. They're implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms. The EV market is, trucking along in both the EU and particularly in China, where it's just really taken off the last few years. So this is an opportunity for Canada to define what being, climate competitive means, to borrow the Prime Minister's term. And one thing that could mean is really, truly trying to get the emissions from our oil sands production down. But if we make that contingent, that type of investment contingent on a new pipeline, it's going to wipe out the gains that we'll see from some of these big carbon capture projects and other initiatives.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that analysis, Janetta. Thank you very much for this. It's been a very interesting conversation.
Thank you very much.